The title of our talk is Odor Assessment of Automobile Cabin Air by Machine Olfaction. I'm Susan Schiffman. The first author is Juan, she couldn't be here. Ryan Hodges and Dr. Nagle and I are at North Carolina State. Ricardo Gutierrez is at Texas A&M. And our collaborators and sponsors of this particular project are at Hyundai Kia, is Gail, Luckey, and Crowell. One of the problems with new cars is obviously odor, and there are many odorous components inside of new vehicles. The headliner at the top, the dashboard, door trim, steering wheel, armrest, seats, all of these have odors. The center console, floor mats, which we're probably all quite aware of, and the carpet. And the whole aggregate odor has an impact on the consumer. So what we're interested in is measuring this. Now, what are the specific materials that are responsible for these odors? They arise from the outgassing of hundreds of volatile organic compounds from the materials inside of those particular components. For example, leather tanning compounds, the smell of the new seats, for example. I just bought a new car, so I'm very aware of this. Dyes, fabric dyes from the cloth seats, fiber treatments, carpet dyes, adhesives. Adhesives, many of them have very bad off odors. Paint ingredients, plastics, plasticizers, foam cushions, adhesives, and sealants. And these odor qualities of the materials can invoke emotional reactions, and they can impact the decision to buy or to appreciate, be satisfied with your car. It turns out the olfactory system, which is located in the top of your nasal cavity, projects into a part of the brain called the limbic system, which is the emotional area of the brain. So when we smell something and we get in that new car, we can in fact have an emotional response to it, and that is biological. So the goal of this project is very simple. We want to avoid unacceptable odors, and there are actually people with new cars who do use face masks because they're so bad. And we want to have an acceptable odor that's good for our children and that's green for the environment. So we've done a lot of literature searches and also done some GCMS to see what are the VOCs inside of cars. There are hundreds of them. There's an extensive literature on this. But you tend to see a lot of aromatic hydrocarbons and aliphatic hydrocarbons. For example, there's a paper by Yoshida, several papers by Yoshida from Japan, where they looked at what the highest concentrations are and what is the individual compound with the highest concentration and what's the total VOCs. Now I want to point out to you something at the bottom, where the green building lead recommendation for total VOC concentration is 0.5 milligrams per meter cubed. Look at the maximum VOCs in these cars. 14 milligrams per meter cubed. We're 28 times above it here. 64 milligrams per meter cubed. The VOCs inside of cars, new cars, is just way above lead recommendations. Even individual components, for example, xylene is the highest one in one study. It's 4,000 micrograms per meter cubed, or 4 milligrams per meter cubed, 8 times above, for one compound, above the lead recommendation. So you get things like xylene, toluene, aromatic hydrocarbons, you get nitrogen-containing compounds, many of them are unpleasant, and even alcohols. And there's certainly aldehydes and esters as well. So if you look at individual compounds inside of cars, there are some that are above the odor threshold. An individual compound itself could have an odor. For example, here's some that are that I've looked through the literature and then looked at the odor threshold. And you can see the ratio where if that number is more than 1, in the where it says ratio of the cabin air to the odor threshold, all of those are above the odor threshold. And what are those compounds? Well, we get the alcohol again. So there's a sweet kind of pleasant odor, but along with it, a putrid, harsh fusel oil odor. And that's kind of the characteristic of the internal cabin air of a new car. It has some pleasant, sweet, aromatic aspects to it, but on the other hand, it has a kind of pungent, penetrating, irritating aspect to it. So Most car manufacturers now want to screen their individual components and to try to understand what are the compounds that are causing these odors and to minimize them tremendously. So how is this done? Well, it can either be done with odor panels, which is something that I have a lot of experience with. It's costly to train an odor panelist, and also you're exposing them to xylene, to toluene, and to styrene and things that you don't want to necessarily be exposing them to. You can use gas chromatography, which we've also used, but this is very complicated. There's no individual information on odor components, although I have hooked up an odor port and trying to smell the peaks as they come off, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what the aggregate is. But machine olfaction is the one that really seems to have a lot of interest and has probably most promise in this particular area. We've used almost all of the different machine olfaction e-noses. This is one, the NST, which no longer exists, which happens to be my particular favorite. But Dr. Nagle and Ricardo Gutierrez have built them, e-noses as well. So those are our options. So what e-nose are we going to use to be able to do this? Well, we decided to try something different. We decided to use ion mobility spectroscopy, and we used the Lone Star machine, which is from Owlstone, and we also used a photoionization detector. And we're trying to see whether we can predict the human panel. That picture happens to be from Hyundai Kia inside of a chamber where we did these experiments. So there's a chamber up there. We exposed people to the odor inside of the cars up there, and then we try to compare the data with machine olfaction. So the people inside the cars, there were 4 panel members. They rated the odors for intensity, irritation, and pleasantness, and also a variety of other adjectives. But what we really tried to see here was whether we could take an odor sample from inside of those cars, use the photoionization detector and the Lone Star, signal process it, and see if we could come back out with the human data. So let's just look at what a PPB ray does. And this basically is you have the gas enters the instrument, passes through a UV lamp, it's ionized, and then basically you can look at the charged ions flow to charged plates, and you can measure the current, and it can tell you how many molecules are there. We used a 10.6 EV lamp for this because that seems to be right below that is where most of the odorous compounds are. The only one that I think is even above that is acetic acid. So that was the detector here. This was one, we went to Cambridge about a year and a half ago to learn how to use this instrument. It's very interesting. It's from Owlstone. It's a field asymmetric ion mobility spectrometer, and it's called FEMS. And what happens here, you have the odor comes in, you ionize that source, and then you have an oscillating waveform. And what it does is it takes those charged ions, you get ion separation based on the mobility, and then you have a detector at the end, and at the same time it detects the positive and the negative ions. So the ions enter the electrode channel, and they take different trajectories based on their mobility in the face of this oscillating field. What you come out with here is a lovely fingerprint, okay? And you have 2 separate fingerprints, one for the positive ions and one for the negative ions, and they're recorded simultaneously. And this is just an example here. There were 5 chemical species mixed together, and the top one shows a dispersion field matrix for 2 of the positive product ion peaks, and the bottom one for 3 of the negative ion peaks. Now what comes out of this is a huge amount of data. These dispersion field matrices, you get 50,000, this is where the challenge comes in, 50,000 data points in a 3-second scan. So you need to be able to have some way of compressing the data, and we did in fact use principal components to do it. So I'm not going to go through because we're running a little bit late, but here's all the human panel rated things, odors from none at all up to maximum, and irritation from none at all to maximum. and pleasantness from extremely pleasant to extremely unpleasant, and here are some of the measurements. So, as I explained before, what we did is the odor comes in, we've got filters putting the clean air into the automobile cabin, and then where the humans are in the cabin, one of the people in the cabin is measuring with the PPP ray, and then we're also then collecting the inside of the air with the Lone Star. We had 10 different vehicles. Some of them were leather, some of them were cloth, and of those 10 vehicles, we had some that were just at regular temperature, and some we heated up, as if you're sitting out in the sun in Valencia in the summertime, and then letting it cool down, and you're going to have many more VOCs that way. So here's basically all the signal processing. The Lone Star, I want to start with that, because the Lone Star, we first tried to use PCA on that data, and then we ended up by adding the PPV ray data and then trying to predict the human panel. This is thanks to Ricardo Gutierrez, who got his degree. I guess he worked with you, Santiago, right? So he helped us with this. The traditional method, you're going to start with a sample matrix. Remember, you have the negative and the positive matrix. You have a 20 by 52,224 matrix, which is ridiculous. So if in the traditional method, you'd end up with a huge matrix, which is very difficult to analyze. So we use something called the snapshot method. And this is the positive and negative matrices up here. And what we ended up with was basically 3 eigenvectors. And you can see it breaks at around 3 eigenvalue numbers. And so the ones above that are probably not so necessary. But what was very confusing to us at the beginning is that we couldn't figure out what those loadings were. You can see that first it happened on principal component 2 was the heaviest loading. Well, what we discovered, this study was done partly in the spring and partly in the summertime, and there was apparently some drift in the machine. So when we compensated for the drift, then our first principal component was in fact turned out to be quite well related to pleasantness and unpleasantness, etc. Here's what I tried putting these little colored dots over it. The square red is a hot leather car, leather seats. The oval red is cars with the that had been treated with heat with the cloth seats. And you can see there is certainly a breakdown with regard to temperature, but it's not totally broken down. I mean, there are some overlap. And then we also looked at the PPV rate. So there's certainly a good, we've certainly got a good fit with regard to the first couple principal components. With regard to the PPP ray, there were also fairly good correlations with intensity, irritation, and pleasantness. And some loadings on the components for the analysis from the Lone Star. Now, what we tried next was to see if we could combine the data from the two approaches. First, we just started out using the Lone Star and trying to look at what the correlations were. And this is with all 20 samples, which is 10 cold cars and 10 hot cars. So you can see that with 3 principal components, well, on pleasantness, for example, we get a correlation of 0.809, 0.81, okay? We can, and it degrades a little bit as you cut down the number of principal components. Then we took the two principal components and an orthogonal, we used the PPP ray peak rating, and we got it up to 0.86, okay? Then we also, this is using just principal components regression. Then we tried another technique with Ricardo, and this is partial least squares regression, and we can almost get a perfect fit. Now the question is, how robust is this model? So then we used k-fold cross-validation, and so we would drop out two of the cars, like a cold and a hot car of one model, let's say a cloth car. And then we would drop out two more cars, so we'd have 18 cars. We'd have a testing subset, which is the two cars that we dropped out, and then we'd have the training subset. And then we'd try to see how well we predict using that, how good was our original model. Well, if you look at the regression and cross-validation responses, you can see we certainly do drop down in terms of correlation, but if we go down to the lone star with the two principal components, and the pleasantness, it's 0.755. So we did fairly well. So our conclusions are that both the lone star and the PPP ray are correlated with human data. We combine them together, we get an even better model, and that we hope that machine olfaction is feasible for replacing the human panel for evaluation of these cars, because they do contain xylene, styrene, and other compounds.